see if that triggers any new demand. Thanks for joining me on the Comstock channel. I'm analyst Brian Grete, and I want to take a look at soybeans and China and everything else that's going on in the ag community at the moment. That seems to be the story. With the government shutdown, I think that it's even putting more focus on the fact that China hasn't been in the market for U.S. soybeans. And there's a planned meeting coming up at the end of the month or early November around the Asian summit in South Korea between President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. And it looks like China's taking off the kitty gloves, if they had them on to begin with. And if they had on regular gloves, they're just taking them off, and it's bare knuckles at this point in time. They kind of doubled down, and China will now require exports of rare earth metals to have export permits. And so that's a way of Beijing tightening the controls over those metals leaving the country. And China accounts for about 70% of total global supplies on that front. So that's a big deal. And basically what it is it's telling Washington and the Trump administration and President Trump directly, hey, we're not messing around here. When those meetings roll around, we are serious. And this adds leverage to what China is trying to do within those negotiations. Now, what the end result ends up being, no one really knows. I know on the U.S. side of things, soybeans are a big deal. President Trump has mentioned that will be at the top of the list of items that he talks about with President Xi when they meet, assuming that they do meet. And so there's a lot at stake here for agriculture, and China's definitely not backing down, that's for certain. With China's aggressive purchases of Brazilian soybeans for fall delivery, and then the recent purchases that happened when Argentina cut its grain export taxes for a brief period, and Chinese buyers stepped in, swooped in, and purchased aggressively the Argentine cargoes, more for fall delivery and into early winter delivery. There's been a lot of talk about, does China even need to buy U.S. soybeans during the 2025-26 marketing year? And we've already lost a chunk of that business. We're into the heart of what would be traditionally the prime export season for U.S. soybeans. And so that demand is pretty much gone at the moment. But I've been told by a reliable source that there is still a need for about 7 to 8 million tons of beans that China would need to bridge until they get to the new crop harvest of Brazilian supplies. And keep in mind that happens, usually Brazil's harvest kicks off very late at the end of the year or into the early part of the new year. And so in this case, it would happen in very late December into January. But their prime export season doesn't kick in until sometime around February, March, typically. And it appears that China may need 7 to 8 million tons more soybeans than they currently have on the books. So that does open a little bit of window for the United States to ship some soybeans to China if we get some sort of a deal in place. But like I said, China has taken off the gloves at the moment and are preparing for a full-out battle on this front. China does have state-owned soybean reserves, thought to be about 25 million metric tons, that it could tap into. But the question is whether or not they would. China historically likes to have a quote-unquote rainy day reserve, and so they aren't historically real willing to tap into those unless they need to. And the more likely scenario when they sell out of those state reserves is that they're old supplies that are going out of condition and they need to move them. And that doesn't appear to be the case at the moment. This appears to be a case of whether they would use that reserve supply to bridge the gap, so to speak, to cover some of that 7 to 8 million tons that I've been told China may need to get to the new crop Brazilian harvest. Don't expect China to be a buyer of soybeans here in the near term. They're going to play this one out, see how it all shakes out, see how global prices react in the near term. And we just don't anticipate much Chinese demand either from Brazil or Argentina, and definitely not from the United States ahead of those meetings. Now, if the meetings go well, I'm told that maybe China could offer up some token purchases in that 3 million ton to 5 million ton range. But that's still very much uncertain. One, the meeting has to take place. Two, it has to go relatively well. And three, China has to agree to make some gentleman's agreement purchases or goodwill purchases at that meeting or shortly thereafter. And so there's a lot of variables that are still at play in terms of whether China would need soybeans. Now, I mentioned that Argentina recently reduced its grain export taxes, cut those, and very quickly the exporters registered a bunch of shipments. The global buyers came in and swooped in and made aggressive purchases, including China on the soybean side of things. Now, Argentina also just recently changed its export regs. And you can see that they modernized them, so to speak. These were basically 30-year-old regulations that were changed. And the reason they changed them was to appease to the global buyer, and that'd be primarily China. And so not only is China swooping in to take away the U.S. soybean market at this point in time with supplies from South America, but now it appears that the sorghum market and sorghum demand is also at risk because of that. So this is a move by Argentina to take away more of the sorghum market from the United States. Through the first 8 months of the year, all of Argentina's sorghum exports, just over 1.2 million tons had gone to China, and it looks like that will remain the case. Here is a picture of where the U.S. stands in terms of soybean and sorghum sales to China. Now, as you can see on this chart, it says as of September 18th. That's the last data that we have as of September 25th. And the data as of October 2nd were both delayed because of the government shutdown. And so we are 2 weeks removed from having fresh data on this front. But as you can see, nothing on the books for either soybeans or sorghum to China for the 2025-26 marketing year. Obviously, China's been a much bigger buyer of U.S. soybeans than it has of sorghum, but China remains the number one market for U.S. sorghum historically. And so that's another market that is struggling here with the lack of Chinese demand. So now we wait. We wait to see how the Trump administration reacts to the moves by both China and Argentina on the soybean and sorghum fronts, respectively. We wait to see if the meeting between President Trump and President Xi happened at the end of October and early November. And then we wait to see if that triggers any new demand, sort of goodwill agreements, purchases from China, and how things transition forward. Very much uncertain situation, a lot of things in the air. We know that China isn't buying U.S. soybeans or sorghum, and two, it appears that China, along with Brazil and Argentina, are making arrangements to make sure that they can get some of those supplies or most of those supplies without having to come to the United States if there isn't a favorable agreement between the U.S. and China. For the Comstock Channel, I'm analyst Brian Grete.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.